move on to next week. I want to talk to you about how you can get the most value out of your portfolio investments. And I called this not application portfolio management, but application portfolio estimation. Since this is a measurement-oriented conference, I will only talk about how to use the data to make defendable decisions. So application portfolio management is far wider than only using the numbers. So I will focus on what I'm best at. And I think in the application portfolio estimation, a lot of what I encountered in the last 20 years and what we have discussed today in the previous presentation comes together. Well, we basically had discovered already in the introduction by Paula. One of the important things is what I want to stress is that insight has more or less become my life motto. And I will show in this presentation that insight is very important for managing a portfolio. And what we see over the last, well, I think several decades already, is that organizations increasingly rely on software. And that means that even organizations that don't consider themselves IT organizations are relying more and more on software and thus have an expanding application portfolio. And to keep this portfolio up to date, organizations need to prioritize the investment in software. Since it requires resources and both financial resources and human resources, and both are usually limited. Even a company like Google or Apple can invest in everything. So you must make choices. And in order to make good choices, you need good estimates to be able to use the limited resources in the most efficient way to get a grip on your portfolio. And what do you need to have grip on your portfolio? The first thing you need is insight. And what's important about insight? It's something that was mentioned by Thomas in his previous presentations. You need to be able to compare things. He used the horsepower example to show that some things are better than other things. But you need to be able to compare things to see whether you make the right choice. And basically two questions are then important. The first one is, what do I have? The funny thing is that a number of customers I've worked with over the past number of years sometimes don't really have an idea of what they have in terms of software assets. Well, the main things your organization rely on in their primary process, that's usually okay. But there are a lot of things like tools your employees use to do secondary processes that also costs money and time to update. And quite often there's not a complete insight in what you have in those kind of things. And what's even more difficult in a lot of organizations I've worked with is to have an overview of all the contracts that are associated with it. I've seen organizations that outsource their software portfolio just to get rid of the magnitude of contracts they have and go to one contract with one sourcing party. Paula talked about the things you need for that in the first presentation. And the second thing you need to know when you know all your assets is how big are they? And of course, on a conference like this, functional size of what you have is one of the main drivers, because the functional size of software is the main driver for effort, for maintenance effort, the development effort. But another aspect of how big is it is who is using the software. If you have some type of software that's only used by a few people, you may have other service levels for that software and other priorities for that software than when your software is used by the majority of your employees. And don't forget that nowadays a lot of customers also are users of your software. And it's also an important thing to know what processes are supported by the software. Is it your primary process or are it secondary processes? That's quite important thing, and I'll come back to that later in the presentation to make informed decisions about priorities. So again, the important thing is to have insight in what you do have and how big it is. But insight is useless without action. You can know everything there is to know about what you have and how big it is. If you're not going to take action on the information you have, well, why bother about getting the insight? So you need to set priorities, and there's always a fringe between the demands and the budgets, because the demands increase usually while budgets are under pressure usually. And especially in this COVID crisis, I think this becomes even more relevant. And because of this fringe, that means that not all demands from the business can be fulfilled, and you need to prioritize. And many of the customers I've worked with over the past few years are struggling how to prioritize. Because what you see is that prioritization becomes a political quagmire if you don't have a transparent process for it. Without a transparent process, you run the risk of getting crushed in company politics rather than be seen as an IT professional making defendable decisions about the portfolio. But how bad is the situation really? Well, this is some interesting statistics about the demands. The forecasted demands, I must say, at least for this and next year, for new software and IT services. And the spending on the enterprise software and related technology will increase by 7.4% next year, with the IT services only 1.1% behind. While the overall IT spending, including things like hardware and communications, is expected to rise by only 4.3% next year. So due to the impact of the coronavirus, some investments in software and IT services have been put on hold. So for this year, a decrease is expected. But if you even look further back, you only see that demands are increasing. So your portfolio needs to be in shape for that. And sorry for that. Because more and more companies are relying on software, it means that if your portfolio is not in shape, you're out of business. But the problem is that you need money to fulfill these demands. And the figures I got from computer economics seem to show that there's a fairly stable increase that's lower than the demand is rising. But you need to know that this figure is measured as a percentage of corporate revenue. So the corporate revenues have gone up more than enough over the last decade to account for the growing demands. But since the coronavirus cut a lot of revenue growth, I think the fringe between the demand and the budget will become more pregnant in the coming years. The most recent predictions suggest that our economies can take up to 5 years to recover to the current level. So this means that if you don't have a prioritization problem this year, you will have next year, because budgets will decline. So how do you do that? Well, the easy answer is let value decide. But as previous speakers also mentioned, value is a very difficult thing to have a decision on. The discussion on how we should quantify value is already going on for more than a decade at least. And not only in the software domain, there are different views on value. When I searched, I usually use Pixabay for the images in my presentations. And I searched on the idea of value. I came across a lot of different things. Most of them had to do with monetary value, of course. But I ended up with this picture of a stained glass window, because that's also some form of aesthetic value. And if there's one thing I've learned over the more than 20 years that I'm working in this field, is that it's not only the money that counts. In software, value is often linked to the features that help organizations make money or attract visitors or fulfill the public demands. But if you're only focused on these features, you run the risk that your portfolio becomes a shiny collection of features that's incoherent, unmanageable, and therefore increasingly expensive. So the idea of value is that you need to set priorities in your portfolio. It needs to be broader than the shiny collection of features. You must also look towards the future and make your portfolio manageable in the long run. So how do we let value decide? Well, there's one thing. It's not from. It's taken from the Scaled Agile framework. I think most of you are familiar with that. But The original research from Mr. Reinhardt that lies under this is much older than that. And that gives a useful prioritization mechanism. It's called weigh the shortest job first, or WSGF. This framework, or this concept, teaches us that value is not an absolute thing, but a relative one. In WSGF, value has two aspects. The first one is the cost of delay, and the second one is the cost or time to fix it. And the investment in your portfolio where the cost of delay over the job size gives the highest result should be done first. And this principle can be used at any level. So from the portfolio level down to individual sprints. And this does not mean that you can't do long projects, which take a large job size and bring the number down. But they need to fix a very high cost of delay. At the epic or portfolio level, formal techniques to do this add the most value. Because at sprint level, already some of the speakers before me spoke about it, can be used. Because if you have a horizon of 2 to 4 weeks, you can use informal techniques to determine the priority. But when you use this technique, organizations have a balanced mechanism to determine the value of investment proposals. And the important first concept, the cost of delay, is built up of 3 things that give a notion of value to the organization. The first one is the most common one. That's the shiny feature. That's the user business value. And do users prefer a new feature over an existing feature? Does a new feature bring new revenue to our business, or it gives a higher customer or user satisfaction? And are competitors bringing new features to their software that could lose us customers if we don't follow? The second one is, well, a bit more difficult for more of the organizations I've worked with. That's time criticality. The value of new features decays over time. The longer you wait for it, the less relevance it has. And one of the things is that companies who work with personalized advertisements on the web need to take into account that if they are on the Apple platform in the autumn, iOS 14 will be released, where it's much more difficult to get personalized advertisements to your audience. Some things, like in the government domains, there are fixed deadlines of new legislations that comes into force. So you must take that into account as well in your cost of delay. But the third category in most of the customers I work with is quite a forgotten one. That's the risk reduction or the opportunity enablement value. that contains things like restructuring your code to prevent priority 1 incidents. If you really have an idea of the importance of some of your processes that are supported by the software and what the real impact to your organization is of a priority 1 incident. Last year we had seen some research that the cost to solve a priority incident on average in Europe is €80,000. And that's only the cost to the organization. And that's not the business you lose by being unreachable during such an incident. Other things that are in this category is risk for future deliveries. You need to keep your architecture stable. And you also need to look ahead. Can we use the information we get from our current software to gain more business, to help customers in a better way? For instance, by adding artificial intelligence capabilities. And you also must look further to see if new features will enable new business opportunities in the future. For instance, by capturing the data in a data warehouse for the artificial intelligence to make clever use of it. So that's all embedded in the cost of delay. And the other thing, of course, and I will come back to that, is the job size. And if you combine that, you get a prioritization mechanism. I visualized it here in 4 quadrants. If you have an investment opportunity that costs you a low amount of effort and brings you a high amount of value, do now. That should be the highest on your list. The second on your list are things that bring high value, but also cost you high effort to implement. And that's what I call the do next. If there are things that can be done with low effort, but bring low value, well, they are nice to haves, or the do later category. If you have time for them, fine. It brings some value, not much, but if you can squeeze it in somewhere in the sprint, please do. If there are things that hardly bring any value and will cost you high effort, those things fall in the category don't do, or try to prevent them if possible. So this is the basic mechanism you can use to have a defendable prioritization mechanism for your investment decisions. You can quantify everything and just send them in an ordered list and start at the top. And in this way, decisions about portfolio value are defendable and are not political. So you have this transparent mechanism to determine what to do first and what to do later. Well, the second thing you need for the prioritization is to determine the job size. Well, we have had a lot of talks about that already. Two of the things are important in this. The first thing is always use more than one technique to determine the job size. Of course, formal size, especially on bigger investment decision, is the best way to go, because it's standardized and you can use historical data for productivity, or even better, like Paula said, use your own data. Team effort is one that everybody knows, but we all know from history that tend to be too optimistic. And if you have historical data on run projects, you can also use analogy. So always have two, preferably all three methods to determine your job size, and always require at least a 3-point estimate, especially for team effort. That's for some organizations a change in behavior, because they're not very used to that, just giving a single number. And well, what we have observed is that at the portfolio level, the formal techniques are the best way to get predictable estimations. And to get the most value out of your portfolio requires a certain estimation maturity. So you need to organize that. And well, what is important is that an estimate is not a certain number, but is a distribution to allow decision makers to decide upon how many risks they are willing to take. And when that change of thinking has sunken into the decision-making process, then the use of probabilistic techniques is better acceptable. So decision makers can choose to claim critical resources with a high certainty percentages, usually 70% or up, and use a lower percentage for normal or low risk investment proposals. How this works, I think most of you are familiar with that. This is taken from an example we used for a Scandinavian ministry. If you have a 50% probability investment cost of 370,000, then that should be the budget for the party that's going to implement the new software. And the 70% probability investment, 435,000, is reserved as an internal budget. In this way, you have a contingency budget of 65,000 when more details about the project become available. And the same thing is for the schedule. 50% probability is 13 sprints. But if you have to make a political commitment, well, you can better go for 70% probability or higher, like 18 sprints, because you don't have to tell the minister that the project will be late. So that's something worth investing in if you want to have successful application portfolio estimation. How do you make this work? The first thing is to make someone responsible for the portfolio. It seems an open door, but there are organizations in which there is no single one responsible for the whole portfolio. Describe your prioritization process. That's the second thing. So that if there is a discussion, you can always point to the process and say, hey, this is what we used, this is what we all agreed to, and this is why your project is not on the list for the coming quarter. The third thing is, and that's for some of the organizations that I helped in the past few years, difficult is to document the value of proposal. Determine the cost of delay, and determining the job size is already difficult, but determining the cost of delay associated with a proposal is for a lot of organizations quite new. You have to think in value. And if you do so, that helps organizations understand why some of the proposals are not accepted, because it only brings a low value to the organizations or only to a limited number of people. And for the job size, use at least 2 different estimation techniques and require at least a 3-point estimate, or better, even a probabilistic estimate. And like Paul already said in the first presentation, if you don't have benchmark data, start with publicly available benchmark data and then professionalize from here. So to wrap up, if you want to do good, make use of application portfolio estimation, make sure you have insight that you can act on. That's also important. If you don't act on it, you don't need the insight. Decide on priorities using data. Data should be objectively comparable. And use objective prioritization and document the mechanism that you use. And use standardized measures for the size of software. This is, in my experience, the way to get the most value out of your investments in the portfolio. So thanks for your attention. Open to questions now.
Okay, thanks, Frank. We don't have any questions come up, so